my name is Tara Bentley, and I'm the Executive Director for the Indiana Association of Home Educators, otherwise known as the IAHE.
And my name is Courtney Nalin. I am a homeschooling mom of two who also works full-time outside of my home and a volunteer with the IAHE.
Together, we're your co-hosts for Season 2 of the Homeschool Indiana podcast. We'll be here each week sharing information to help you homeschool, keep you updated on what you need to know, and have some fun along the way. So, let's get started.
Hello, everyone. This is Courtney. Tara is not with me today, but I am so excited to be here with Mr. Jay Wile from Berean Builders. And I know that he has some wonderful things to share. If you're not familiar with him or the curriculum and all of that, you are truly missing out. It's just wonderful, wonderful stuff. I would just love to get started with you, Jay, just to hear a little bit about how you got started, your background, that kind of a thing.
Well, I got a PhD in everybody's favorite subject, nuclear chemistry. And my plan for the PhD was to do original research and be a university professor. And so I started that. I was at Indiana University first and then transferred to Ball State University. So I was getting grants from the National Science Foundation for original research and then teaching, university level classes. I also got a chance to teach at a program that was specifically for gifted and talented high school students. And I enjoyed that a lot too. But along the way, as a professor, I started noticing these students who were just significantly better than everyone else. And I came to learn that most of them were homeschool graduates. While I was at Ball State in Indiana has probably the freest admission standards. I wouldn't say low, but they're the most open, let's say. And in the early 90s, it was hard for homeschool students to get into university, but Ball State's policies were open enough that we had more than our fair share of homeschool graduates. And so I didn't know anything about homeschooling or anything, but I find out that this thing I'd never heard of was sending me my best students. So this is so 1990s. I actually just looked in the phone book.
That's awesome.
To see if there was something about homeschooling in the yellow pages. And it turned out at that time, IAHE had a listing in the phone book.
Nice.
So I just called them and said, I'm a professor at Ball State University and I've experienced these incredible homeschool graduates. And I don't know if you could use the help of a university professor in any way, but I'd love to encourage more students to come to Ball State. And so, of course, they set up speaking things for me. And the first one I remember was actually a couple of different cities. And we would go and speak to the local homeschoolers specifically about how to apply to college and how to make your child look more attractive to a university. But pretty quickly, they were asking me about curriculum and I really didn't know. I knew what was out there for schools, but I didn't know what was out there for homeschoolers. So I looked around and I was like, well, I don't know much about this homeschooling thing, but I don't see how a mother can use the kind of resources that exist right now because they were all written to have a teacher there. And absolutely nothing about homeschooling. I had a group of homeschoolers who wanted me to teach a co-op. And I said I wasn't really interested in that because my understanding was homeschooling is about independent learning anyway. So I told them I would just write them a course and send it out chapter by chapter. And I'd put my phone number in there and said, call me if you have questions.
That's amazing.
And what's really funny is about 12 or 13 chapters into this, I get a call from a lady in Ohio. And she says, I hear you've written a chemistry book. In my mind, I wasn't writing a chemistry book. And so I said, no, I've never written a chemistry book. And she says, well, I have a copy of something called Exploring Creation with Chemistry. I was like, oh, yeah, that is me. But I didn't think of it as a book, really. And she had heard from a friend of hers in Indiana that this was a chemistry course you could actually do at home. And that's when my wife, I got off the phone and told my wife this. She said, this is going to get really big.
Yeah.
And I thought, no, because at this time I was still a professor. And so this was just sort of something I was doing on the side, but it eventually worked out really well. I ended up doing some consulting for a while. And my last real consulting gig was making sure systems were year 2000 compatible. Remember that?
Yes.
And so, I developed a way you could show that your computer system was, if it was running a specific kind of computer, that it was year 2000 compliant. And once that was over, that kind of naturally ended in the year 2000. Yeah, sure At that point, the books were selling well enough that I could make it my full-time job.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I love that you saying that the mom was like, you're writing a chemistry book. And you're like, oh, really? Like, and of course it's going to be big because I mean, homeschooling has grown so much over, well, even the last few years, but several years. And, homeschool moms, man, we find something that people are excited about and that makes it easier for us to teach our kids. We are all over it. And so, especially whenever you get to those subjects like chemistry, the sciences, kind of search for ways to not have to do that or to feel like you can do it and not completely wing it. I mean, a lot of times, me personally, I do feel like I'm winging life in general, but I love resources and I love whenever, people come along, no matter what their story is, that your background of hearing you come into that is so fascinating. I just love to hear how people get connected. I think that it says a lot for someone that has been in the university field and then says, wow, what is it? Like these kids, what is it about them? And then wanting to just dive all in to being able to be a resource and a help. I think that's a huge thing to do.
Yeah, so I took a lot of time off to write these books and everything, off from teaching. About 10 years ago now, I got back into teaching just to keep doing it, keep my feet wet in it. And it's even more pronounced now. My homeschool graduates today are even better compared to everybody else than they were back in the 90s.
Sure. Out of curiosity, what is it that whenever you say that they stood out, what is it about them that seems to do that?
The first thing, and it's really quite simple, but it's so rare in college that you could tell they'd read the book. When I give the first class, I hand out the syllabus and all that, I say something every class, and I feel like I'm just saying it robotically because nobody's listening. If you read the assignment before you come to class, you'll be better prepared for class. Knowing full well that most students never crack the book, but these students would ask questions in class that made it clear they had actually read the book, and some of them would be referring to highlights they had made in the book. I was like, okay, that's not usual. But also the big one, and this is what really I noticed, in my chemistry and physics classes that I taught for science majors, there are other chemistry and physics you teach, but when it was science majors in my classes, I would always ask one question on the test that was unlike anything I had discussed in class. But if you understood the material, you could reason your way through it. And I always said that's the one that separates the real A's from the rest of the A's. And the homeschool graduates were the ones who would at least attempt it. So, 90% of the students just leave it blank. And if they come into the office to complain about their grade or whatever, I ask, why didn't you try this? And they said, well, you didn't teach it to me. But, these homeschool graduates, so what I started doing once I learned about this homeschooling thing and everything is actually looking at the tests and marking in my little log the students who would try every problem like that on the test. And so it was a pretty 75-80% accurate that if they had tried all of those problems like that by the end, I'd ask them, where'd you go to school? And they'd say at home.
That's so fun. Yeah. That's interesting.
Homeschoolers, they're used to trying to figure things out on the fly, since they're not typically taught, not in the traditional sense anyway. They're used to figuring things out on the fly. So they come to a problem that reads like it's Greek and they've never seen it before. They at least have the wherewithal to say, well, how could this possibly relate? And so, they wouldn't always get it right, but they were the ones who would try consistently on those kinds of problems, which I always.
That's so interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Oh, yeah.
So many parents, speaking of, homeschoolers, typically they're going to be taught, they learn a different way. I know that every time you get into like different kinds of homeschooling groups or you come to like the conferences and that kind of stuff, there's a lot of those doubts that parents think that they can do stuff. And even whenever my son was starting in kindergarten, I was worried that I was going to fail. And of course, I look back at the me back then and I was like, now I'm like, bless my heart. Like, I just had no idea. Like, I wasn't going to screw it up. It was fine. But I do know that a lot of parents, they get to a certain point if they start out homeschooling their kids whenever they're younger. Then whenever they get to those older grades, they're like, there's no way I'm not going to be able to teach all the things. And science is such a big thing that parents, especially of like high schoolers or even middle schoolers, are like, how am I supposed to teach these things whenever I either didn't do it whenever I was that age, or I don't remember it, or it's not my strength. So, for parents that like think that they're just not science people, what would you say like to the mom or the dad that feels that they're just unequipped to teach science at home?
Well, especially in the older ages, you aren't really teaching science. You're facilitating the learning of science. And that is a really fundamental difference. As a teacher, when I teach class, I should be able to answer any question that's really related to the class, whether I've prepared for it or not, because that's what a teacher does. But as a homeschooling parent, your job isn't to teach, especially at this level. I mean, early on, you probably are mostly teaching, but these are things you know real well. But once you get to the junior high and high school ages, you become more of a facilitator, and there are lots of ways to facilitate learning. And it doesn't necessarily, in the homeschool setting, it rarely means actually teaching. Even though I'm a teacher, when I homeschooled my daughter, I didn't. We adopted one later in life. She was a teen already. And I did very little. The only thing I taught her was math because she needed a teacher. Everything else she did on her own. And I could have just defaulted into the teacher mode in all of her classes. But, part of the strength of homeschooling is learning how to learn on your own or learn in a non-traditional way. So I think the big thing is for parents to get out of their mind that they're teaching. And one of the easiest ways, one of the best ways actually to facilitate learning is to simply learn right along with them. And I know that's hard sometimes when you've got lots of kids and all of that. But if you can't do that, then you find someone else who can, like a mature peer or your spouse or somebody. So, if you've never had chemistry before and the kids, you're afraid of that, then just take the chemistry with them. And it works really well. Because, if you think about when I went to university anyway, I learned very little from my professors. I learned when me and my buddies got together and studied. That's how we figured it out. And that's really, if you can get used to that already in high school, you're going to have, and this is one reason they were so good at university, you're going to have a leg up because most students, I don't know what most people were like, but most of the really good students I've had would tell me, I never cracked a book in school. And it's true. I never cracked a book when I was in high school, except to do the homework that you were required to do. Yeah. So, that's a completely different thing, So if you haven't learned it, that's fine. You learn right along with them. And if in high school, you can teach them that skill, then it doesn't take a teacher. It doesn't take even a good teacher. It just takes someone else helping you learn. That makes a big difference. I was talking to this person I knew from homeschooling. He graduated Cedarville University with a electrical engineering major. And he said when he got to Cedarville, he was actually behind in math. What they were thinking he should know was new to him. And he thought, obviously either the curriculum I didn't use was right or my mom didn't make me go far enough. He thought he was good at math, but it turned out he was behind. And I said, well, you got your degree and you can't get your degree in EE without serious math. So what did you do? And he said, well, I knew how to learn, so I just caught up. And that's
good.
Because he was homeschooled, he already knew how to do that. He didn't have to figure out how to do that and then catch up. So that's the leg up you get if you can just get out of that teacher mode and get into this mode where you're just helping them learn.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. I'm glad you said that. I feel that a lot. And I will say that I even have gotten to where I will make fun of myself to my kids because I'll tell my kids we will be doing some type of lesson together. And I'll say, oh, I don't know if I never knew that or if I'm forgot it or what. And it's exciting because then if I'm excited about it, then that shows them like, oh, wait, this is exciting, especially like they don't know any different. So I really appreciate what you're saying because that just kind of validates how I feel that if you can teach them how to find a love of learning and help them know how to learn, then really they can do anything that they set their mind to do. So I think that's a big help. But you're right, getting out of your own head a lot of times because we think that it has to look a certain way and all of that.
We're pulling our kids out of school and then we think we have to replicate school at home.
Right.
That makes no sense at all.
Like, what are we doing? Why are we doing that? Yeah, I think it's easy to get into our own heads. We might even feel really inspired and like we can do this. And then the day-to-day life stuff kicks in and your kids are crying and they're like, I don't want to do school. And you're like, you're not even actually doing school. Like if you only knew.
If you only knew.
But it's also part of parenting. So yeah, then we have to get back out of our head again and all of that. So yeah, it's a balancing act. That's for sure. So what would you say, why is it important for Christian families to teach science from a biblical worldview? Or do you feel that that's important? And what's your standpoint about that?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you have to be careful when you use the term biblical worldview because that tends to be much more specific to a lot of people than what it really is. I would think most people would agree C.S. Lewis had a biblical worldview, but he was an evolutionist. He believed it. He actually says in one of his last essays, evolution produced the brain, but God gave us the mind.
Mm.
And so, you got to be careful what you mean by
Right.
a Christian worldview. But yeah, I think it's important because, first of all, if Christianity wasn't around, we'd have some sort of science, but it wouldn't be the science we have today. The scientific method, hypothesis, make a prediction, test it with experiment. That's actually from the church. Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln back in 1000 AD, said, we have this standard way of studying the Bible. We call it theology. We need a standard way of studying God's creation. And he gave a couple of ideas, but he really didn't have very good ones. Somebody who followed him, Roger Bacon, he might have been a student and was probably just influenced by him. He actually came up with that method. He said, you have to be prepared to believe, then you have to test it by experience and experiment, and then you can go on. So that was the scientific method itself comes from the Christian church, and it was a theological motivation for science. So since science at its root is Christian, it only makes sense for Christians to study it that way.
Sure.
But more importantly, several people, my favorite scientific quote about nature comes from Blaise Pascal, who was one of the most important scientists of his day. He said, nature has some perfections to show that she is the image of God and some defects to show that she is only his image. And he said, by studying nature, you're studying an image of God. And so that has all sorts of implications for how we should, not only how we should approach science, but actually how we should appreciate science. Unlike some of the academic subjects you kind of have to do, science is actually a way of actively engaging with the creative mind of God, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
And if we can, and that's one reason I think at least a lot of Christians like my material. I don't hammer out a lot of detail about what you're supposed to believe and all of that, but I do continually give the creator his praise for the incredible design that we see in nature and all of that. And so when you're constantly reminded of the creator, and I'm not afraid to take the scientists that we're learning from and quote them about because most of the scientists we're learning from were Christians. And so, James Clerk Maxwell, who's the father of electromagnetism, he said a prayer before every experiment asking God to help him understand nature. And so I'm not afraid to do that. And that, I think a lot of Christians, they like that, the idea that, hey, here's somebody whose work we're studying, but he's actually a Christian. And part of his motivation for doing this is his Christianity.
Right. Yeah. I love that quote that you said. I've not heard that quote. And man, I'm like, now I'm going to have to go back and write that down because that was deep. That was real deep. I love it.
There's theology in there and everything.
That's great.
He was a brilliant man.
It is fascinating whenever you think about I know that, again, like learning alongside of my kids, it has been such an amazing process to whenever you start looking at how intricately things are made and not just at the beginning, but just over years and lifespans and all the things. And even if you look at the human body and all the intricacies of that, like each individual organ, sometimes I have to sit and just stop and I look at my kids and I'm like, that was amazing. They're like, are you okay, Mom? I'm like, yes, this is so cool. Like, this is amazing. How can you even not associate it with God? It's just incredible. It's beautiful. But yeah, I love that quote. What do you think makes, talking about where you aren't afraid to quote like the different scientists and share that kind of stuff, what do you think that it is with your curriculum that makes it very unique outside of that? I mean, I think that in and of itself makes it unique. So what is it?
Yeah, I think before we leave that, the other thing I say is I don't try and force it. There are a lot of these curriculums made for Christian homeschoolers where they got to get a quote about God in there. So they quote a scientist that they're not studying at the time.
Sure.
Or they never study anything the scientists did, but we got to quote a scientist in here that mentions God. So here goes. No, I only do it when it's actually relevant to what's being discussed, which I think it doesn't feel forced. It feels very natural. And that leads me to the other thing that's pretty unique about the way I write. I write like I'm speaking. So the reading is very natural. I don't, when I published lots of peer-reviewed scientific studies and discovered a couple of things back when I was serious about that. And the people, the editors of these publications would say, you got to get rid of this. This is too emotional. This is, and it's like you read the old scientists like Kepler. Kepler used to quote poetry in his scientific work, but you can't do that anymore. So I had to fight to write scientifically. So when I wrote these books, I was like, well, I'm just going to write the way I want to. I'm going to communicate science the way I want to. And so the reading is just so natural that even though you're reading big words and about crazy stuff, it's just such a natural way to read that it's easier, I think, to understand.
Yeah. I'm glad that you decided to do it your way, because I think that absolutely makes a difference, especially if you're trying to help your children to learn things. Most people, unless they just have a mind that was created to read technical stuff, everybody does better if you read, and you can read it like you're having a conversation, and it's interesting, and it's your regular language. And it doesn't mean you can't expand your vocabulary and your knowledge, but you should be able to at least read it, to be able to understand it. Most of the time, families have more than one child. And so a lot of times they try to balance what things do they do as a family? What do they need to do separately, and that kind of stuff. And there's obvious things like maybe like your math is going to be an obvious thing that it's going to be different based on their ages and where they're at. But how do you feel this works for those that have multiple ages to teach?
Well, the elementary curriculum is designed specifically for this. And this wasn't my idea. I don't know if you know the company, My Father's World.
Yes.
But the wife there is Marie Hazel. And she tried to convince me I wasn't interested in writing elementary, but she convinced me I should. And she was specifically what you need is an elementary curriculum that works for all elementary grades. And so I looked into how people try and do that. And so our elementary course, everybody K through 6, maybe even K through 7, depending on the student, they do the same lesson, but every lesson has 3 different levels of review. And that's how you adjust the expectations. The oldest students have to get a lot from the lesson. The youngest students don't have to get as much. And so it truly can be a whole, family thing. And that continues until they get to the math level. And that's why you said math is individual. At some point, they have to start pairing the math level with science. And that's when they start having to split off. And that's usually when you're finishing up all your arithmetic. So usually when you're taking a pre-algebra course, that's when you peel off from the rest of the family. So that may be 7th grade, maybe 8th grade, something like that. And so that's when you have to, now we have, a lot of times it works out that because the whole family was working together, the 2 oldest kids, even though they're a couple of years apart, have the same math, and so they can do the same higher level science.
Sure.
But yeah, usually that's when you start peeling off.
Okay. Would you say then for people, like if they are, whether they're just like starting into homeschooling or they're just new and they're looking for something different and they're trying to decide where to start,
Mm-hmm.
where would you suggest that they look into where they should get started? Would it be more of like the age based for where they are with math and decide from there, or how would they get started?
Yeah, because I think you need to assess it based on the student. Because if you say, oh well, we need to start at the beginning, so let's start the elementary and maybe move through it fast and then try and you're not going to be challenging the student enough. It's not challenging enough just to do the elementary curriculum 3 times the normal speed. That's not challenging. Challenging is making the student think. Mm-hmm. And early on, that's done with the elementary curriculum, but later on, you can only do that with the higher level stuff. So I do think you have to assess the student. Now, I don't think you have to follow everyone's guidelines. You know your children better than I do. So there are obvious exceptions, but the general rule of thumb is they ought to be doing some sort of junior high school science when they're finishing up all the arithmetic, when they're done with all the arithmetic. But, once again, you know your children better than I do. And so that's important. The woman who pretty much single-handedly made homeschooling legal in South Africa, her child, she didn't know this, but her child's dyslexic. And so they did first grade for 3 years. And I met this young lady when she was a teen, and she spoke the Queen's English. She was very knowledgeable on a lot of things I would have never known had she not written me a letter a real letter. Those things used to
One of those
exist.
real things. Yeah.
And like letters were backwards and stuff. It was like a 7 or 8-year-old wrote it. And I don't do letters. I do email. So I was composing an email and I was going to make it really snarky because I thought she was playing a joke on me. But, the Lord checked my spirit and I asked her mom and she said, oh yeah, she's dyslexic and all this. But, the idea is for her, she knew that even though she had spent a year in first grade, that wasn't enough. We need to spend another year in first grade and another year in first grade. So a mother and a father know the child better. And so you shouldn't be trying to adhere to anybody else's external schedule. But there are rules of thumb you can at least start with.
Sure. Yeah. I love that you balance both of that out because it's very true. It kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier with that we've got to get out of the mode of thinking that we're teaching, but we're facilitating. So instead of expecting our kids to fit into a bubble that society says they should, if we recognize they need more time or we recognize that they can do more or need to be challenged more, then we can have that freedom to be able to do that and explore that and see them go a long way. And I think that that's really encouraging too, because whenever you share stories like you just did and you see that like so many families think, oh, well, if my child is a special learner, if they struggle with things like dyslexia or ADHD, some other type of different learning challenge, I would say, then they think, well, I won't be able to do that. I can't homeschool them. But the beauty is that they actually get to do it in a way that works for their kid instead of seeing their kid struggle trying to fit into a box of a brick and mortar school. So I think that says a lot whenever you see them down the road after they've accomplished the things and they're able to look back and share their story. So yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. And that whole mindset that everybody's got to be doing the same level of thing, that's never happens in the real world. I mean, in the real world, you have high-level scientists doing high-level science. You have mid-level scientists doing mid-level scientists. You have other scientists who are just teachers. No, I'm not saying just, but who are teachers and not doing any science. And you got people who have blue-collar jobs, and they're all absolutely necessary. So we don't expect adults to all be doing the same thing at the same level all the time. Why in the world do we expect kids who are in the middle of development to be doing all the same thing at the same time?
Amen. That's a sermon right there that could preach. I could get fired up about that. Now, I know you recently were with us at the IHE Parenting and Homeschool Conference. That's always a hit. We always love having you. And you were able to do several different types of workshops, both for the younger ones and the adults. And so thinking about all that kind of stuff and whenever like you do different experiments and, and presentations and stuff, do you have a favorite experiment or anything that you always love how much it surprises families or like people get really excited about to see?
Well, when I go to conferences, this is one thing that the IHE Fort Wayne conference was different for me. I don't normally do experiments in class. Sometimes I show videos, but it's just if you're traveling on a plane, most of this stuff that you need to carry isn't legal.
They probably frown on it.
So I don't really do it, but Fort Wayne was one I could drive to, and they specifically wanted me to do something on theater because I was a professional for a while, but I'm an amateur. And I said, I don't really know I don't know any tricks of theater. I read the script and do it the way I feel, but I can do some how science special effects work. And so I did the thing that was everybody's favorite was I actually launched a fireball from my hand. Had a plexiglass tube. My son-in-law actually made the launcher for me, a plexiglass tube that had a removable back and had a little circuit in there and some nitrocellulose, which burns very fast and not very hot, actually. When I completed the circuit, that would light off the nitrocellulose and it flew from my hand. And everybody really loved that. It looks really dangerous, but I told them this is the one thing that, a scientist knows, and this is why you don't play with this stuff at home, is because I know how nitrocellulose burns. I make it myself. You can buy it's called flash powder, or flash cotton, but I make it myself, so I know the properties and everything. So I knew that even if that had gone haywire and gone out into the audience, it wouldn't have hurt anybody. And that's, you don't want to do that with a methane flame out of your hand or something like that. So, that was part of it, knowing what's safe. But yeah, no, that was a lot of fun. I wish I could do that more, but like I said, the limitations of travel make most of that possible. You can't, because you can't even take night. It looks like paper, and if nobody noticed, okay. But if somebody saw that was not, and they have those little things they swab your. Those one of the things those react to is nitrocellulose.
Oh dear.
You just can't even take that on a plane.
Yeah, you really don't want to have to explain that. Be like, I'm going to a homeschool conference and we're learning science. Yeah. Well, I for one am glad that it worked out for you to do that.
Fun.
I know we always love, having you at our any type of event that we have for IHE. We always love that, and everything that you learn, it's always a hit. We always hear great feedback. People are always, marking down the who do we have to go see, who do we have to go listen to, and that's always like that's a winner right there. So yeah, I would totally vote for you being able to do those more often. So I'm glad they asked you, and it worked out. What do you think, like how do you think that parents can foster that curiosity of the learning? I know we've kind of touched on it a little bit here and there, but especially for those that maybe they were similar to me where they didn't come from the homeschooling background, or maybe they pulled their kids to homeschool. So they have that and they're trying to get out of that mindset. But then like if their kids are just in that mind frame or the parents struggle with like, creating that curiosity, is there anything that you could offer as advice?
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing is, if you really do dislike science, you got to hide that. You got to be as fake excited as you possibly can be.
We need the theater part to that part.
because that's part of what, I won a lot of awards when I was, teaching awards at university are often not very coveted because you tend to not make tenure when you're a good teacher. But, I won all sorts of awards at university when I was teaching just because I was enthusiastic about it. And students would say, so I think, even if you have to fake it, be enthusiastic about it. But the other thing I would say, and a lot of parents don't like this, but it's really true, is especially in the younger years, do lots and lots of hands-on stuff. It's part of it is figuring out what turns your student on. Like, we got our daughter as a teen, but had I homeschooled her when she was in elementary school, I would have just taken her to parks and had her sit down and draw what she saw and write about what she saw. Because that's the way she engaged. She tried to engage things very creatively, And so I probably wouldn't have done a lot of experiments with her, but I would have done a lot of nature experiences with her. For a lot of other students, it's experiments, seeing cool things happening and then learning the science behind it. So I think you've got to do what works for your student, but it's got to be hands-on because that's what drives curiosity. And the older you get, the harder it is to teach by doing experiments because you have specific skills now you have to develop and so forth. And so, you can't teach balancing a chemical equation by doing an experiment. You just got to do it, So as they get older, they'll be doing fewer experiments. So the time to do experiments and experiences and things like that are in school. And also, I like I said, we adopted this daughter as a teen. And one day we were driving, she was like 20 now, and we're driving through town, and we pass a dairy that's in our town. And I said, did you ever do a tour of that dairy? Because she was in school before, we adopted her. And she said, no. And I was like, I should have asked her that when homeschooling her, and I should have taken her there because that's something everybody ought to see is how milk is done. So I actually did. I called them and I said, I know you guys do tours for schools. Will you do tours for just me and my daughter? And they said, oh, and so I think they thought my daughter meant little kid.
Sure.
And we show up and it's like, you're the Wiles? Yeah, but we loved it.
That's awesome.
So, I think those kind of experiences, zoos and stuff like that, aquariums and things like that, anything you can do to get them really not looking at pictures, but experiencing real stuff.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I appreciate that. And you're right. There's some parents, I even one of those ones where I love the idea of hands-on. If I've learned anything by homeschooling, I have learned what type of learner I am. So whenever I'm at work and I've had to learn new things, new skills, or other parts of like my job, it's actually helped that I've learned that I'm a visual learner, and I do have all the other ones, but I'm strongest in my visual. So I am one of those parents though that I love the idea of doing the hands-on things. But sometimes I'm like, oh man, I'm just so tired. But sometimes you just have to deal with it. You just have to say, this is what has to happen. But I appreciate that you mentioned even the experiences, because just because I hadn't thought about the fact until you said it, that really your kid might be more hands-on, but not in a hands-on like an experiment way. It might be that experience of being able to go out and see and do and see it in person. And shoot, I think it's great that whenever your daughter was 20, that you went ahead and gave her that experience, because we're always learning.
Yeah,
So go ahead and give her that opportunity. So I appreciate that you pointed that out. That's a really good point, because I think a lot of parents think, oh, I've got to do all the things. And really you are doing the things, but they don't have to look like everybody else's things.
Right. And the main goal isn't to get through a certain amount of stuff. The main goal is to help them figure out how to educate themselves. Because just like that electrical engineer I was talking about said, you could look at it as the mother failed because the math curriculum wasn't rigorous enough, or she didn't hold her child to a high enough standard. But in fact, she did the important thing, which was to help him figure out how to learn on his own.
Yeah, absolutely. My teenage son, of course, I had to laugh a couple of times because you talked about like the yellow pages, and I'm like, yes, my kids would not have any idea. Writing a letter. I mean, my kids, yes, they would understand that a little bit, but they'd much rather like text it to somebody, but I would have never thought about the IHE being in the yellow pages, but that's fantastic. I'm like, man, that's so cool.
I can't remember. There was some journalist who actually went to a bunch of 20-somethings different and asked them, how do you mail a letter? And most of them didn't know.
Wow.
They didn't even know where you'd buy a stamp.
Yeah. And I guess, oh man. Yeah. I guess there is something to be said for, depending on which generation is homeschooling and how they homeschool, then your kids may or may not know some of the things that is a benefit to homeschooling, because you can actually still teach them about that kind of stuff. My youngest just went to her first middle school dance this past weekend, and it was 80s theme. And I was like, I've got you. Yeah. I've got you. And she's like, okay. And before you knew it, she was all decked out. She actually ended up winning one of like the best outfit award thing. And I was like, yes, the jelly bracelets came in for the win. Yeah. I don't know. But I will say, like, on outside of that, it's funny because like my son, he is just a tech. He loves tech. He loves science, and he's just so in a different area than I am. I like that kind of stuff, but not his way. But there are a lot of times where I won't like name drop of which phone we use, but we have a certain type of phone. And so I know how to use that type of phone. But like my in-laws don't use that. And so my son knows the stuff that we have, but he learns so fast and he knows how to figure things out because he's had the opportunity to just experiment and think things through, that he had stuff figured out, and he does it all the time. He's like, here, I'll just figure it out for you. And so now I just go to him at 15 and I'm like, can you fix this? Tell me what I need to do. And then I tell them about cassette tapes, and it's a good balance. So
yeah, cassette tapes. Exactly.
It's fine. We're all learning together.
First computer I ever programmed, you saved the programs on a cassette tape.
Yes. It's very fun. My kids, especially my son, he likes to pick on me a lot. He'll be like, was that back in the olden days? And I'm like, you better be careful. But I also know that it's all in fun and it is good times. But he does know about some things that some kids his age probably have no idea about, just because of us being able to build that relationship and have that learning environment at home. So I think that it's been great. And that did make me, I thought earlier, I wanted to ask you too, with your books, talking about the different, like the hands-on and the experiments or suggestions in your stuff. For those that don't know, do you give that type of stuff like for a lesson? If you're like, okay, here's some experiments that you can do, here's some activities you can do, that kind of a thing?
Yeah. So every book, even all the way through physics, it has experiments that are tied directly to the reading, and they're in the book. So the instructions for the experiments are in the book. There are samples of how to document your experiments on the website and so forth. So you can, it's not, it's once again, it's not like a traditional textbook where you usually have the textbook and then there's a separate lab manual. No, this is all integrated. So you know when to do everything you're doing because it's there in the reading.
Okay, good. I thought if I was I was sitting here thinking, like, if I was a parent that just didn't know much more about it, it all sounds great to do experiments, but the idea of if you have to come up with it on your own, that just sounds really cumbersome. So I know that that's appreciative too.
Yeah.
So for families who weren't able to come to the IHE conference recently, maybe they've not been able to see you or hear you speak. Hopefully they will have that in person again in the future. Hopefully they'll do that. But where else, what's a good way for them to find you, to get in contact with you and to learn more about your books?
So yeah, the curriculum and all the stuff about the books is on the publisher's website, and that's Berean Builders. The publisher wants to build Bereans. I remember the Bereans were the ones who wouldn't just take what Paul said. They had to check it against scripture. And that's the kind of student the publisher wants to produce. So it's BereanBuilders.com. I have a website, drwile.com, where you can find my blog and stuff like that. But everything related to the books is on the BereanBuilders.com website.
Okay, great. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes too, for those that need to go back and do that. Or maybe they just want to write you a letter.
Yeah. Hey, I like just a couple months ago, I got a letter. Not only was it a letter, but they had a wax seal on the back. So they had invested in the dress. It was stamped with the young lady's first initial. And I was
that's amazing.
That's cool.
Yes. I love that. That is really cool. That's very creative. I mean, you can't fault somebody for doing that kind of stuff. That's amazing. So any final words before we wrap up? Anything that you want to share, like maybe is there anything new coming up for you or something that you're currently working on or doing soon? Or
well, I'm editing a couple of books right now. I haven't written a book of my own in a couple of years now, but I'm editing a health book written by a nurse and then an engineering book written by 3 engineers. And they're going to be available for homeschoolers at some point, but we have no target date as yet. So that means it's at least a couple of years out for both of those. But I'd say the main thing is, we always question ourselves, especially, and we should, when we're making decisions that are going to affect our children's lives, we have to always question ourselves and everything. But my experience is for the vast majority of parents, you're already doing better by homeschooling. Even if you're a pretty lousy homeschooler, you're still going to give your child a better education. One thing I did early on, and I haven't done this in years, but you can actually take some of these studies that have been done comparing homeschoolers to public schoolers, and usually compare averages. But if you do it a little differently and say, okay, here's the average for publicly schooled students. How many homeschooled students score at that average or above? The answer is usually about 90%. Usually about 90% of homeschoolers are scoring at least the national average. So, even if you're in the bottom 15% of homeschooling, as long as you stay out of that bottom 10%, you're still doing better than the public schools.
Sure.
So it's not a high bar. And I think you have to realize that because your motivation is different from any teacher's motivation. Some really dedicated teachers really do love their students, but they still don't love their students as much as they love their own kids. That's just the way we are. So you're starting from a different motivation. That's going to produce real long-term benefits to the school.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I know that will for sure be an encouragement to those listening. And I think that we can always use that reminder, even if we've been doing it for a long time. Even veteran homeschool parents need to be reminded that you're still doing good, like you're still above the bar and doing good things. And it also circles back around to you talking about being made in the image of God. And if you've got them on your side, you are winning already. So yeah, I just appreciate what you have shared with what you're doing. I am so grateful that the Lord saw fit to lead you to seeing what homeschoolers are doing in your classes and who it was that was excelling to bring you this far. You've been such a blessing to so many families, and I know you will continue to be. So I just appreciate you taking time with me today to talk and share, and we look forward to seeing you again and maybe seeing some other fireworks at a future conference. But thank you so much again, and just really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you.